really deserve a round of applause, by the way. There you go. Coming out on Saturday to take a look at some really important issues and I think learn a little bit and explore what are we going to do about it.
That's fine.
I forget to do this a lot. My name is Kathleen McQuillan. I'm with the American Friends Service Committee. We're based in Des Moines. And we're giving some attention to one of the same things that moved to amend Eastern Iowa, moved to amend, and other parts of the state. We're looking at it under the banner of governing under the influence, taking a look at how corporations, their money, through campaign contributions, through lobbying, is driving policy. So as you look around, you'll see some of our banners about, this one's about the Pentagon, how much money they put into the system, and boy, the rewards they reap for it. So we're going to have two of our staff present a little bit later. One is Kevin Rutledge at the back table, and at the further back table is Hector Salamanca, who came on Wednesday. But they're both working on this Governing Under the Influence campaign, and we hope you'll have them around in Eastern Iowa a little more. Well, I'm very appreciative of the Eastern Iowa Move to Amend inviting AFSC to be a part of this gathering. We think it's an important effort they're leading, and we're just delighted to have a chance to be a part of it. I'm really particularly honored that I get to introduce our first guest, who is a colleague of mine, and Greg Coleridge is staff person, is the program coordinator or director of the Ohio AFSC. In addition to that, Greg is the principal of the National Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy. Some of you might know it better as POLAD. Greg's been working on these issues of corporate corruption for a very long time. He's been bringing that voice within AFSC as well as without, or outside of it. He's been awarded, he's a recipient of the Common Cause Public Service National Award for his public service achievement. He's also a member of the American Monetary Institute, and I knew this part, he was coordinator, he is the coordinator of Move to Amend in Ohio, in the Ohio Network. So Greg, if you would come up and take over from here, and I think we'll all benefit from this presentation. Thank you. Yes.
This.
I think that works.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hope everyone can hear me. I always appreciate the opportunity to be anywhere where I can stand and everyone else sit so that I can see everyone eye to eye. And now it's a little harder actually to see. I'm not going to be using the PowerPoint, so there's no real need to dim the lights if that's okay. Well, I just wanted to begin by thanking Dawn and all those others who are responsible for organizing the event here today. It is an impressive testimony to all of you to, on such a beautiful Iowa day, to be devoting part of your Memorial Day weekend to this.
More beautiful here.
Well, couldn't agree more, couldn't agree more. You know, I'm from Ohio, and I must say that I think that Iowa and Ohio have a few things in common. In addition to being a four-lettered Indian name of a state and being a major corn grower, of course, we know that both states are, for the most part, culturally, not necessarily given all that much attention to, right? Politically, economically, culturally, except once every 4 years, where for a few months, longer here in Ohio, or here in Iowa than in Ohio, we're sort of, along with a couple of other states, sort of the center of the political universe. But there are, of course, some differences, and among them is one that I think has some relevance for today, and that is that we have this little pond on the northern part of our border, actually a lake called Lake Erie. And that Lake Erie is, of course, the smallest of the Great Lakes, but it's also the most dangerous among all the lakes. Any reason why?
Pollution.
Well, pollution, somewhat, but I heard somebody else mention. It's the shallowest of all the Great Lakes, which means that when there is a storm, when there is a huge wind that comes up, a giant gust, if you are swimming or if you are on a boat, there is, of course, danger that you will capsize and drown, lose your life. Well, that is a reality of nature. But I think it's also a reality of politics. That when you are shallow in your awareness and understanding, without rootedness, without depth, without a sense of groundedness, you too, and we too, can become swayed, can become taken away, can, if you will, capsize, and be easily moved somewhere else, depending on what is the major sort of political story or narrative of the moment that is being uttered by someone who looks attractive, sounds charismatic, and the like. There is, however, a growing awareness and understanding that our governance is not neutral, objective, fair, equitable, just, compassionate, and honest, but rather, as is the theme of this symposium, under the influence, that it's biased, stacked, or rigged, or as is best captured by a guy I saw at the DC Occupy wearing a t-shirt that said, "Our government isn't broken, it's fixed." As in rigged by the super wealthy and corporations who and which not only have money and not only have power, but have rights, and in many cases never intended inalienable constitutional rights. You know, those things that were meant to be reserved only for human persons, human beings, which, as David Cobb has said, and I concur with Move to Amend, is if you have a belly button, you're a human being, a human person. If you don't, you aren't. Well, we could spend all day sort of describing the problem, focusing on the many ways, myriad of ways, that never intended inalienable constitutional rights for corporations, as well as this bizarre constitutional doctrine that money is not property, but rather equals speech, has distorted, deceived, discombobulated, corrupted, perversed, alienated, captured our government, our public officials, and to some extent our communities, and certainly have changed and repressed the ability of us, we the people, to have our voices heard, our communities helped, our environment protected. The depth of awareness and understanding required that I think we're challenged to sort of get beyond and learn the lessons of Lake Erie, however, isn't only about describing the problem. And you know, we could spend all day going into how big money in elections and corporate constitutional rights corrupts, perverts, through privatization or corporatization, healthcare, education, transportation, foreign policy, trade policy, budget policy, tax policy, finance monetary policy, you fill in the blank policy. Because pretty much it's almost all policies, certainly political and economic. Easily we could spend all week and, if not more, delving into those. But gaining an understanding and an awareness of what's going on requires more. It certainly requires understanding, analyzing, criticizing, synthesizing issues. But it also requires a recognition that we have to know how we got to where we are. And it also requires that we spend some time looking at strategies for change, real strategies, authentic strategies, strategies regarding governance, which is a fancy way or academic way of talking about power. The power that we should have, the right that we should have to decide. the right to decide, or what other people would call self-determination, self-governance, self-rule, sovereignty, democracy, take your pick. But you get the idea. It's the ability of us to have the authentic voice in the shaping of decisions that affect our lives that are decreasingly possible, given this fixed or rigged political system that is largely due to increasing never-intended rights of corporations and money. What's happening today regarding the privatization or corporatization of, you fill in the blank, is not inevitable or irreversible. It's not how it was meant to be. It's not like gravity. It's not like the tidal waves. It's not like the swallows returning to Capistrano. The decisions of how we got to where we are were deliberate, conscious, planned, strategic, created by people, which means they can be uncreated, they can be changed, they can be abolished, they can be amended, they can be evolved. It's a question of us breaking out of our colonized minds as to what is possible, what is doable, and what are we willing to try to do. But certainly it's not inevitable, and it's not how it's meant to be. And that's where the history, we only have a half hour, but a 2-minute history, and some of you know, if you've had some dealings with POCLAD, that's sort of how I got into all of this. It was sort of an aha moment for me. When people were going around the state, Richard Grossman, Jane Ann Morris, doing these Rethinking Democracy, Rethinking the Corporation weekend retreats, where we learned that corporate rights were never intended, that corporations were meant to be subordinate, that we the people controlled them through the democratic tool or instrument called the charter, and that the corporate charter was a way that gave specific definition to what a company could and could not do. That their basic purposes, corporations at the time, which early on basically served the purpose threefold, of doing no harm, providing a useful good and service, and obeying all laws. That's it. They didn't have rights, they had privileges that we the people gave to them via the charter. And just as individuals gain charters or licenses if you want to practice in a state, like probably here in Iowa, if you want to be a lawyer, a doctor, a psychiatrist, a professional person of any sort, if you want that right or that privilege to practice, then you have to adhere to certain basic responsibilities, certain basic testimonies, certain basic standards that we the people and those we elect set. That was a corporate charter. It was a democratic tool to control, to define, to authorize, not to negotiate with, not to treat these entities as equal to us, but for us to be superior to, because that's what sovereign people do. And just as the king was sovereign over his entities this side of the Atlantic, like the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Carolina Company, the Baltimore Company, and so many others. These were chartered corporations that the sovereign king gave to groups of people to do the king's business this side of the Atlantic, economic and political. They had no inalienable constitutional rights. They could only do what the king said they could do. The Revolution constitutionalized those crown corporations. We became the sovereign, and we took that sovereignty seriously by making sure these entities would not become equal to, let alone superior to, human beings. That was the charter process. And if and when a corporation violated the terms of its charter, that charter was revoked. And that was done routinely. In my part of the world, in Ohio, we did a little research of that, and you can check it out on the table over there of our information that looks at the history of Ohio and the corporate form. When a company violated the terms of the charter, it was revoked by the state legislature. Those charters were revoked by the state Supreme Court, by Democrats, Republicans, you name it. However, corporations didn't take all this democratic muscle flexing sitting down. They responded, and they chose to escape democratic control in 3 ways. One, by shifting decision-making from the legislative arena to the judicial arena. Second, by shifting decision-making from the state level to the federal level. And third, by trying to shift decision-making and authority and control from the legislative level to the newly created regulatory arena. What's going on today? We can get into it, cussing and discussing. These trade deals, it's the same thing. It's using the same plays that corporations have used for over a century, just now trying to shift decision-making from the federal level to the international level. Well, corporations, of course, fought back in these ways, and, of course, by going to the judicial level and trying to get themselves anointed, as they did, with 14th Amendment, inalienable constitutional rights meant for freed black slaves, due process and equal protection, then Fourth Amendment rights, search and seizure, Fifth Amendment rights against takings, First Amendment rights of free speech as well as the right not to speak, Fifth Amendment rights, right to jury trial, and others. And along the way, money, those well-to-do, not just the rich and the super-duper rich, worked at trying to extend their rights through their money by defining it in 1976, Buckley versus Vallejo, as not being money, but as being, or property, but as being free speech. And so this is the predicament we have, and why so many people as a result, since those two entities together have resulted in a feeling of our government being hijacked or captured. Why so many people, I feel largely, why so many people feel disillusioned and feel that government doesn't reflect their interests. Just a poll last week by Gallup says 26% of Americans say they are satisfied with the way things are going in the nation, and that Congress and politicians are the most commonly mentioned problem. There's a massive and growing disconnect between what people want or don't want in the policies we have or don't have. And again, we could spend many a moment talking about examples of that. From better fuel efficiency standard, more funding for alternative energy, more spending on mass transit, support for gun buyback checks, focusing on job creation instead of reducing the debt, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this focuses as to sort of how we have gotten historically into this predicament, how strategically and intentionally the corporate entities, those who run corporations and the wealthy few, play the system. So what do? How do we respond? And what's the authentic way to respond? Well, I think that it's certainly part of our agenda needs to be focusing on changing the players of the game. Those are people we elect or unelect. And there's a role for elections. Part of what the governing under the influence is trying to do, not necessarily focusing on electing and unelected, since the AFSC, 501c3 can't focus on elections, electoral strategies. But that is a legitimate strategy, trying to focus on changing the players of the game. But that's not enough. Nor is it sufficient in of itself to try to change the plays of the game. Plays of the game are things like laws, regulations, which we certainly need. Better laws and regulations on, you fill in the blank. We could spend a lot of time talking about that. But maybe more important is focusing on changing the rules of the game. The rules of the game applied and in the context of what we're talking about is our Constitution. It's the ultimate sort of governing rules that determines what people can and cannot do, how government should act vis-a-vis people, and what companies and those artificial entities we create, what kind of powers and rights they have or don't have. And therefore, that's why Move to Amend came about, following, and in fact, on the very day the Citizens United decision took effect and was decided by the Supremes in the controversial 5-4 decision. But it's important, and in a perverted way, very perverted way, Citizens United was a blessing. It was a blessing. Because this effort to try to get a handle and understand and have awareness about growing, never-intended constitutional rights and the role of money in elections has been going on for a long time, as previously mentioned, a long time. But the powers to be got greedy. Instead of just taking a thin slice of the pie, of the salami, of the loaf of bread, you pick your metaphor, they got greedy and took a big piece. And it became something that For the very first time, many people thought this was a problem. Now, for people who, for the very first time, thought this was a problem, the solution can be quite simple. Just reverse Citizens United. Just begin and end with Citizens United. Just mess around maybe with the laws of Citizens United, increase transparency, or if you're going to go as far as you can, then let's have a constitutional amendment that changes it. That's what Hillary's talking about now, right? She's made some overtures toward that. And I think Lindsey Graham has spoken in the same vein, and some others. So I mean, that in a sense is the success of this growing movement. You can't ignore it anymore. So what do? You try to co-opt it. And so you try to provide something that's going to maybe go back, as this would do. By simply reversing Citizens United, we would go back to the grand, glorious democratic nirvana, right, of January 20th, 2010, the day before the decision. You remember those days, right, when your voice was authentically heard, right? When the issues we cared about were being dealt with profoundly and authentically and realistically. That's what many people want to go back to, including those in Congress. The Udall Amendment last year focused largely on Citizens United, maybe dealt a little bit with the money equals speech. But Move to Amend doesn't address that. It says we're probably only going to have, if you will, one bite in this generation at the constitutional apple. And if we only have one bite, you know, it's not like a law. It's not like where you can sort of pass or try to pass 10% of what you want, create a demonstration project for something in 5 communities, see how it works, in a year or two come back and try to get 20% more, 30% more. It doesn't work that way. Historically, if you look at the Constitution, it's only been amended 27 times, and 10 of them were all together. The first 10, Bill of Rights. So we're only going to get one crack at this. Shouldn't that effort, if we're going to go through all of this time and energy and effort, if we're going to sacrifice a beautiful day on a Memorial Day weekend to be in an enclosed room and learn about these archaic issues, shouldn't the effort be worth the while? I think it is, and that's why working to end or abolish never intended constitutional rights and working to end money as speech is what Move to Amend seeks. All of it, the whole enchilada, if you will. Just simply end by focusing on and saying that, you know, this has happened before. The Constitution has been amended. It took women, to be sure, from the 1848, right? Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1920. That's a long time. Didn't quite take as long in some other efforts, right? To reduce the age of voting from 21 to 18 took just a couple years. I like to think that if you look at that span from how long, from the women's rights, 19th Amendment to reduce the age of voting, that's going to be somewhere in between, but much, much closer to reducing the age of voting. Why? Well, largely, I think, because of reality. Each and every month, every time there is a further hijacking of democratic self-rule, of home rule, of privatizing healthcare, of saying the people of Vermont don't have a right to even label genetically modified organisms. Never mind banish them, but just label. Why? Because the industry is going to come back, as they have, and are saying, and are challenging in court, you're violating my First Amendment rights not to speak. Just as the voters of Seattle that passed a minimum wage law, or the legislature, $15 an hour, is being challenged in court by corporations saying you're picking on the fast food industry. So therefore you are violating, and it's in court, being challenged on 14th Amendment due process and equal protection rights. You are picking on us, you are discriminating against us. This kind of nonsense, Hobby Lobby, it's not a corporation, it's a person with religious values. I mean, it's bizarre, it's crazy. It's crazy. This craziness is going to happen. This money being spent in elections, what direction is that headed? You know, is it getting less and less? Actually following the McCutcheon decision, another Supreme Court decision of last year, and following how money is going, what we're seeing is each and every election, more and more money being spent. But the last election, there was a difference. Last election, yes, more and more money was spent, but now it's being spent or invested, donated, however you want to look at it, by fewer people. Fewer people. It's not the 1%. It's not the 1/10 of 1%. It's the 100th of 1%. If you look at the numbers, as the Sunlight Foundation has done, 100th of 1% contributed or invested 40% of all campaign cash in the last election. There's a Chinese saying that says you are likely to end up where you're headed. Where are we headed? Are we headed right now without changing the rules of the game? Never mind changing the faces, we need to do that. Never mind changing the laws or the plays of the game, we need to do that. But if we don't change the governing rules, the rules of the game, the direction we're headed is going to be where we've come from and where we're heading, which is not a democratic place. So let's learn the lessons of Lake Erie, become more aware, have some depth and rootedness that requires, yes, studying the issues, yes, learning about the examples of corporatization and privatization, yes, understanding how money has been used to buy, rent, lease, or retain, I can never figure out, or public officials. But along the way, let's understand history, let's understand and recognize this is not inevitable, we can change it, and many of the people in this room are part of the change agents. Thanks. Do I have a minute for questions?
It looks like it.
Maybe a minute. Two minutes. Any questions, comments? Discussing? Yes, sir.
You talk about the few that are spending all the money. If they have enlisted the aid of a large number of people, call them the Tea Party or whatever, who have nowhere near those resources, who somehow believe that going that way is the right thing to do, even though it really doesn't seem to be to their economic advantage. How do we intervene in that situation?
I think part of it calls, as George Lakoff talks a lot about framing, reframing, and all, and I think, what are the last 6 words to the Pledge of Allegiance? With liberty and justice for all. People on the left, the quote-unquote progressives, focus on the justice side. Hey, a case can be made, this is all about liberty. It's about having the fundamental power to decide things. And actually, this is a very conservative issue. What Move to Amend seeks to do is to go back to say how things once were. At one time, the issue of defining how much money was in elections was a political decision made by our political elected officials. Corporate rights weren't rights, privileges were made in the political arena by our elected officials at the state and to a little extent the federal level. What these decisions have done, what the Supreme Court did, the activist court, and we talk about activism in the Supreme Court, you want to talk about activism, this is it. What they did is they shifted these decisions from the political arena to the judicial arena, with all the moats, all the fences, all the protections that has given them. What Move to Amend is saying, we're not saying how much money should be in an election. We're just saying no more can it be protected by that Star Wars-like impenetrable shield, by the moats, by the fences, by the walls. We're going to move that back, that decision about how much money should be in elections, what role corporations should have in society. That ain't no more a constitutional arena issue. It needs to become a political arena decision. Let's move it back so that we can engage, where we can grapple in our Congress, in our state houses, and in our city halls. That's where it's a conservative issue. And just local, last thing, state of Ohio, I know a little bit about the most powerful, potent corporation of its day. 100 years ago, maybe you've heard of it, Standard Oil of Ohio, led by a guy, maybe you've heard of him, John D. Rockefeller. In their corporate charter said they were supposed to do whatever they did. They decided unilaterally to form a trust, which wasn't in their charter. That was challenged. To revoke their charter, the most powerful corporation of the day, by an Attorney General, David K. Watson, who just happened to have been a Republican. This is not a Democratic, it's not a Republican issue, it's a sovereignty issue. Small businesses around the country, the American Independent Business Alliance, Businesses for Sustainable Development, other small business associations are for these kinds of changes. Why? Because the current system now is rigged, it's corrupt. When the well-to-do companies spend money, it benefits them with disproportionate tax breaks, low-interest loans, and other goodies. It's creating an unfair economic playing field. The little guys aren't donating money, it's only the big guys. This is a quote-unquote conservative issue that's focusing on liberty. We need to reframe it in that way.
Terrific.